Hello and welcome back, and welcome to 2022. Here we are again, more lockdowns, more restrictions, and more of an opportunity to work on some of our older images. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of you who have subscribed to the channel. That really makes a difference and makes it worthwhile me continuing. And in this video, I'm going to have a look at an image where there were some difficult exposure situations, and I'll step through each of the individual steps in getting this image to look the way I have processed it, and it will also give you an idea of how I get the look that I have in my images. So let's get started. So for this image we're going to have a look at, this is the image that was processed in Lightroom, and it is actually made up of two images blended together to make an HDR image. And we went from the look of this image to this finished image, which has a great deal more depth and feel about it. But to give you some context as to why we photographed here, let's have a look at where we went. Now, this was taken in Iceland a few years ago, and one of the reasons we travelled to Iceland was because we both read this book by Australian author Hannah Kent, Burial Rites, which tells the story of the last woman to be executed in Iceland. And it is in the time of the 1830s, and a lot of the old farming buildings were like that. And this is the sort of thing you would see when you went to Iceland. Some of the old outdoor museums and some properties have old buildings there, and this was how people lived in those days. So I was particularly interested in getting some images of the old buildings because they're unlike anything else we've had in Australia, and probably a great number of other places overseas. And so these buildings look quite charming now, but of course in a lot of the areas they're quite run down and dilapidated. But we photographed in this outdoor museum at a place called Skogar, which is on the south coast of Iceland, and it's well worth a trip there if you are considering travelling to Iceland. There's lots of fascinating things to see there. So that's a little bit of the background. Let's have a look now at how we expose the image and how we'll process it. Okay, so let's go back and have a look at the base images that I used to work to make this image. And if I look at these two here, I made two exposures, and in working inside this building I stupidly didn't take my tripod with me, so I had to do all this handheld, and I made two exposures. Now, a lot of people think if you're trying to do an HDR capture you need to make multiple exposures, but in most cases my experience is two is enough. You've got enough latitude in a modern DSLR or mirrorless camera to be able to extract enough details to make a usable image. And let's just have a look at each of these ones individually. Let's go to this one first, and let's look at the capture details. I stupidly made a mistake here of actually shooting with the flash inside, but I was really trying to capture the exposure for the window. And there's a little bit of exposure there, but essentially all I was concerned about there was getting the exposure for the window. And then again, hand holding, I went to the next image where I took a different exposure, again using a bit of fill flash because the room was very dark, but exposed more to get the correct exposure for the room. And using those two, I'll process those and combine them together. So if we go and look at the develop module now, and let's just have a look at the basic settings here. This one, it was actually not exposed correctly. As I said, I shot my flash and made a mistake, so what I did was I darkened that one down to bring out the detail in the background, and there was plenty of latitude in the file. So what I did was process this one to get enough detail in the window, and this one processed to get a decent balance in the rest of the room. And you'll see if I look at the highlights, you'll see that it's blown out around the window, but that's not a major problem. Now, the next step I did was to combine those into an HDR, and there's a very good reason for doing this in Lightroom rather than Photoshop, and that is if you combine them into an HDR in Lightroom, the result is a digital negative file which retains all of the raw processing capabilities, whereas once you've gone into Photoshop you've lost that ability. So with these two images selected, right mouse click, go to Photo Merge, and of course we want HDR, not a panorama, and this opens up the panorama merge window, HDR merge window in Lightroom, and I've ticked the auto align and auto settings and to see how this comes out, and looks like it's going to be a pretty good combination. It automatically aligns the images, and so we'll merge those, and I've already done that, so I'll cancel out of that, and here's the HDR merged image, and of course it's a DNG, so we can retain all of our editing capabilities, and therefore we can go through and do our adjustments to our processing. You'll see here that I've not really done anything much with the highlights. I could drop those a little bit, but we'll move on and look at the other processing. And of course you need to do some sharpening of the image, and obviously probably use the lens corrections to get these effects correct and remove any chromatic aberration. And so with that image processed into a digital negative, we can make some further adjustments and then take it into Photoshop. So we'll move across now into Photoshop and follow the processing there. So here we are in Photoshop with the image open from Lightroom, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the plugins from Topaz, Denoise and Sharpen AI, because even though this was shot indoors, it was handheld, and there's a little bit of unsharpness here, a little bit of camera movement, a little bit of shake probably from hand holding the camera, and we're going to need to try and rectify those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this background layer and apply these adjustments to that background layer so that we can easily see how they look. So with that background layer selected, we'll go to our filters now, and if you have Topaz installed, it's available here. And first thing we're going to do is go into Denoise and look at removing any noise from the image. And of course Topaz works as a plugin for Photoshop, and I'm just going to pop that up here. And easiest way to look at this is to go to a comparison view and look at the different options. The latest version has four different models of sharpening, and we can then have a look and see what it's going to do. And if I just look at this vase on the center of the table, we can see the different options. We have the standard model, the clear version, low light version, and severe noise. Now in either of these I'm not going to look at any sharpening. I'm really going to look at getting rid of any residual noise in the image, and in all of these versions there's not a lot of difference, but I think in this instance the clear model is the one that I prefer. So by clicking on this model and then going to the split view and allowing it to regenerate the preview, we can see the difference, and you'll see there that even with that it's removed a lot of the blur from the image, and you'll see here only doing low sharpness once we select that. If I go into the auto options, it will want to try and apply a higher level of sharpening, but I'm going to do that separately. So with that version selected and only low sharpness, medium noise reduction, you'll see that there's a substantial difference to the image already. So we'll apply that, and depending on the speed of your processor on your computer, this could take a fair amount of time, but if you've got a fairly grunty computer, it will go through pretty quickly. And once that's completed, we now have that, and we'll return to Photoshop. So this has now had the denoise applied, and if I zoom in and turn that off and on, you'll see quite a bit of a difference. And the second thing we're going to do is on that copy that's had the denoise applied, we will go into Filter, Topaz Labs, and go to Sharpen AI. And Sharpen AI operates the same way as Denoise. It's a plugin for Photoshop, and the easy way to go is to use this comparison view and select from one of the several models that they have. Now I think there was a little bit of movement in this, so I'm just going to have a look at the motion blur versus the out of focus, and once it goes through and updates, we can see the proposed output. So out of focus normal, motion blur normal is being updated, out of focus normal. Again, we've got two versions of that. Let's try too soft, very blurry for that one. Oh, we've already got that there, so we can try the very noisy one. You can pick and choose from which options you think, or you can allow it to select from auto select. But I think because there was a slight bit of motion blur in this image, I think this is the one I want to use. So let's just go back to our side by side or split image view, let that work up, out of focus normal, or was it motion blur normal? No, it was motion blur normal. Now it's picked up the right one. A little bit of a glitch in the software there somewhere, but it's come up with the version I wanted. It is now updated, and on the left is before, on the right is after, and you can see that it's actually brought back quite a lot of the sharp detail on this image. And let's run with that. So we'll click on apply. It will take a little bit of time to process through, particularly with the Sharpen AI, depending on the speed of your processor. So let's just let that finish, and we'll come back and see the finished version. So here we are back in Photoshop, having applied that Denoise and Sharpen AI. And just one thing to remember, when you're looking at that preview, you're looking at the image at 100%, and obviously you're going to see some fine detail that probably won't be evident in the final image or even in the print. And this is the before and after. Let's just zoom in a little bit tighter. So the before image, there's obviously a little bit of camera movement and shake you can see there, and it's gone a long way towards correcting that. So that's certainly not looking too bad, bearing in mind again that that's still a fairly small part of the image. So we've got the image now looking quite sharp, and of course you don't need to keep this as a separate layer, but I've done this for the purposes of illustration. So I'm going to call this Denoise and Sharpen AI, and you could quite conceivably blend those together. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I want to bring out some of the fine structure and detail in the image, and to do that I'm going to do this separately with a different layer, and this time I'm going to use the Nik Silver Effects Pro. Again, another package that is well worth the investment. And Silver Effects Pro has a number of different options built within the software to bring out some fine detail. I love fine detail in my images. Not everyone likes that, and obviously not for every image, but I have picked a few favorites here, and I think the one that I will prefer to use is one called High Structure Harsh. And here we have a split view in the Nik software, and you can see now that it's bringing out a lot of this detail and texture all through the image that just isn't apparent in the original. And so I'm not going to make any further adjustments here. I'm just going to take it as it is. I'm going to apply that to the image, and so this will now appear as another layer, and I'm just going to move that down. I've kept my original processing in a separate group here. So okay, I've applied the Silver Effects Pro, but of course it's a monochrome treatment. And how do we get that back into color? Well, we change our blend mode to luminosity, and in this case it's a bit too severe, so I normally bring that back to around a 50% opacity, and it's bringing back a lot of texture into the image that wasn't there before. You can see there now a lot of mid-tone contrast essentially is what we're getting in the image, but it's starting to make it look more alive. So having done that, the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to apply another Nik filter which just gives me a little bit more color and contrast, and that is using the Color Effects Pro plugin. And I'm going to apply both the tonal contrast filter and the Pro contrast filter. And again, there is a huge range of filters to choose from within Color Effects Pro, but you can choose whichever ones you like. For my use, I quite like the tonal contrast option, and if you click on that, going back to the default option, again I have a split screen view. You'll see there that it's adding a little more contrast in the colors, but it's also increasing the color saturation. You can see here in particular with this old bureau, it's adding a lot more detail and color in there, and that's what I'm looking for. So I'm happy with that aspect of it, and you've got control here to change individual aspects of the settings, and of course you can also use control points, or you can change the individual opacity of the filter. I'm going to leave that as it is, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another filter which I rather like, which is called Pro Contrast, and by clicking on the Pro Contrast option, the neutral option as it opens has no correction applied to it. You'll see there that there's no difference between, well, that's before the tonal contrast version, but with the Pro Contrast turned on and off, there is no difference. But what we can do here is it's particularly good at doing things like amending the color cast. Now that will shift it more to a blue, cooler color, or back to a slightly warmer tone. I like the warmer tone, and the contrast correction I find is way too severe, so I don't use that, but I do like the dynamic contrast. Just gives it a little bit more of a boost in those midtones. So with the adjustments made, I'll accept those, let that process through, and then we'll see what the next step is. And normally with the NIC filters, they work pretty quickly. So here we go. And I like to nominate on here what I've done is I've done tonal contrast and Pro Contrast. So if I go back over this again, I can see what I've done. So let's just have a look at and see now what we've done to this image. Let's just fit that on the screen. So if we turn off everything we've done from the beginning, you'll see that the initial image was a bit flat. The Denoise and Sharpen AI can't really see much difference at this level. Silver Effects Pro has really brightened it up, and the tonal contrast and Pro Contrast again lifted the image a bit more. So we'll next go in and do a little bit of fine tuning before we finish it off. So now we've finished with the NIC plugins, the tonal contrast and the Pro Contrast, and of course the Silver Effects Pro. The image is looking a lot better, but looking at the overall image now, I can see there are a few problem areas still that need some attention. Firstly, the windows are still a bit on the bright side. I don't want too much effect of the light coming in from the outside, and there's a bit of the area of the ceiling that has caught the flash, and that's really a bit of a distraction. So we'll go through now and just do those final corrections and bring that on home and finalize the image. So I'm going to cheat now a little bit. I've already done most of these separately, but let's have a look now. We've got our final version here, and of course you could flatten all of these. You don't need to keep them separate, but I'm doing this for the purposes of demonstration. So the first thing I want to have a look at is I want to darken these windows. Now I could go through and do a number of different things to select that. Firstly, we could go into the select color range option, and instead of sampled colors we can choose highlights, and you can see here that now I can select the highlights using a different fuzziness slider and refining this until I get a reasonable selection. And if I say OK, you'll see that I've got a selection of the windows, but I've got a lot of other things that I don't want either, so I don't really want that. Probably the easiest way to go is to use the quick selection tool, and with the plus option selected, you can just simply click and fill in these window areas, and this does a pretty good job of selecting these, because it's really only these brighter areas that we really want to worry about. There's a little bit of a problem area there. I don't even think that I want anything else apart from that, so I'm just going to zoom in a little bit tighter, use the minus tool, and just remember with the quick selection tool, the larger the sampling area you have, the wider the color range. So if we're using a very large brush, like a 60 size brush, it's going to select a large color area. If we want to select a very fine tonal range, just use a very small selection, 10 or more or less, and just let it bring in and select those areas, and we've got a pretty good selection now. I'm not too worried about those areas. Let's see what happens with that. I'm not even going to do this window because that one's pretty much okay. So with that selection active, I go to a curve selection, and a lot of people ask, why do you do curves and not brightness and contrast or levels? Well, the simple answer is that curves is a lot more sophisticated. Levels and brightness contrast are just dumbed down versions of curves. So you might as well go and use the best tool available. And here I'm going to just bring those down. Now you'll see that one thing that happens is with using any of the tonal adjustment tools is that the saturation increases as you darken them, and this is a consequence of the particular color model that Photoshop and all other editing software uses. So I'm going to bring that down a bit. I think I'll bring the white point down a little bit to take that brightness out of this top part of the sky, and we'll just darken this down a little bit more. Let's just have a look. Let's just turn that off and on. That's looking pretty good to me. Let's just go back, zoom back out, because when you're working in tight on part of the image, it's often easy to get a bit carried away. And so there's without that tonal adjustment, and there's with. And if you're not happy with that and you want to make a very fine adjustment, you don't need to go back in and adjust the curve. All you need to do is adjust the opacity. And if you just click on the word opacity, hold your left mouse button down, we can use this and adjust the opacity until we get exactly what we want. Something about there looks pretty good to me. So we're not completely 100% with that adjustment. And here's the one I made earlier. It looks like I did do a bit of a selection on that window, but look, that doesn't matter. The other area that I want to darken down is this area of ceiling. Now, I don't need to make a particular selection of this. I can do this quite simply with just using a curves adjustment. I'm going to bring my white point down a bit and darken it down a bit till I get about what I want. And of course, we're darkening the whole image as it stands. So what I'm going to do is click onto the mask, invert the mask, and now simply with my brush tool, because we don't need to have a precise selection here, we just need a brush tool, and with white as our active color, we're painting white onto a black mask, and I've dropped the opacity down to about 50%, and using our square bracket keys we can make this brush larger or smaller, and you can see that I can just paint a little bit of darkness on and just darken that down a little bit to take some of the heat out of that area and draw it, because it's drawing our eye away from what we're really interested in the image. So there we have, very simple. You don't need to do any selection to do that. And the next thing I'm going to look at is overall the image is still just a little bit on the dark side. So by simply doing another curves adjustment, I'm going to brighten the whole image up. Now I've made this previously, so what I can do here is, what I've done is I've brought my white point in a little bit so that I'm starting to push my brightest tone up to the white point where it's going to start to clip. Now to see a preview of that, if you hold down the Alt key and move this little triangle slider here, you get an active mask, and you can see that as I move that in, parts of the image are starting to clip to white. So I don't want that. I'm going to come back to just the edge of where we're starting to clip, and we can have highlight points in our image, it doesn't really matter. And then by pushing the middle of the curve upwards, I'm going to brighten the image overall. We don't want to go too far, we just want a little bit of increased brightness just to give it a bit more life. And I see also now that I've got this rather iffy area over here. It looks as though there's a reflection or a shadow cast from maybe the flash, and what I'm going to do there is I'm going to brighten that using another curves adjustment. You'll see here that I've used a very aggressive curves adjustment, and then I've inverted the mask and just painted there on with my white brush tool and white, and I've just painted that in. Now I haven't worried too much about the painting because that's not really obvious that there's a problem there. So you'll see here that I've just painted that in reasonably roughly. There's still a little bit of a color cast there. I think it's a reflection from maybe this piece in the foreground, and so we can do something about that. And what I'm going to do now is, just looking at that, I think, well, overall the image could probably stand a little bit more saturation. I've just given that a bit of overall saturation. increase just to bring back some of that colour that we've just lost a little bit by brightening it up. And again, you can go as far as you want. I think we don't want it too colourful, just colourful enough is fine. And I've made that adjustment at the end. Let's just go back up, move that right up to the top, and we're getting pretty close now, but I've got a little bit of an issue still with this colour cast here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the colour from the rest of the wall and fill that in there. So going back to my image, if I get my colour sampling tool or the eyedropper tool, I want something like this bluey grey colour from the wall. If I click once here, it now becomes the active colour in my palette, and maybe I want it a little bit more blue, it's like a little grey. If I click on that palette, you'll see where it is on the colour range. It's almost no colour. Let's just run with that for the moment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a colour fill layer and blend that in to take that browny colour out of that. So with that bluey grey colour selected, if I come down to my adjustments palette down the bottom, now unfortunately the solid fill option doesn't appear in the adjustments quick selection. We've got to come down here, and what we want is a solid colour, and you'll see here that it's picked up the colour from my palette, and I'm going to go OK, thank you very much, and let's just move this right up to the top. And what I have now is that bluey grey colour filling the whole image. Well, obviously we don't want that, so what we need to do is we need to firstly change that to a colour blend mode, and you'll see now that we have that colour giving us a colour cast over the whole image. We don't want that either, so now we go to our mask, invert the mask, we're back to our normal colour, and all I do now is with my brush, and you guessed it, the white colour, and low opacity, maybe even less than 50%, we can just brush that colour in to remove that browny colour from the image. And I haven't done a fantastic job of removing that shadow, but we've certainly reduced it substantially. With a little bit more time you could work on that a little more and make that disappear, or even if you wanted to, you could content aware fill and remove that area. It doesn't really matter, but that's the principle there. And the final thing I'm going to do with this image is a trick that I've used previously on some of my other images, and that's called the inverse overlay treatment, and this can bring a lot of life back into the photograph. And I have a shortcut made for this, but I'll do this longhand. So with all of our processing applied, the last thing I did do was I put a slight vignette around the image, and I'll show you how I did that. In this image, it's a fairly rectangular image. I'm just going to use the select rectangular marquee tool. I just want a fairly soft vignette. Draw a line something like that. Make a selection. Go up to the select menu. Modify. Feather. Now I'm going to feather it the maximum amount, 360 pixels. Thank you very much. It is now feathered, so we have a very soft transition between the selection and the non-selected areas. But what I really want is I want this outside area to be the selection where I'm going to darken it. So I would now go to select, inverse, and you'll see now that there's a marching ants around the outside, and then we have this transition area. So with that selection active, I just go to a curves adjustment. It now becomes the mask on the curve adjustment, and what I'm going to do is just pull that white point down slightly and darken it down slightly, and so you'll see very slight vignette, and it can be quite subtle. That's all you need to do. And as I said, the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this inverse overlay treatment, and to do that we have to make a composite layer. So let's go through that, and I'll step by step through that last adjustment. Okay, so the final step we're going to apply is the inverse overlay treatment. Now this has a few steps in it, so I'll try and go through this reasonably slowly. We have all of our adjustments made to the image so far, so what we're going to do firstly is make a new composite version of the completed image, and so to do that we use the Control Alt Shift and E, and on the Mac it would be Command Alt Shift and E. We have now made a new composite layer. Now, working with this, firstly we go over to the image menu, adjustments. First thing we're going to do is desaturate the image. We don't want any color. The inverse overlay purely uses the tonal range to remap the image. So firstly we've desaturated. The next thing we do is we go back into image adjustments and we invert the image, so we now have a negative version of the image. Looks pretty awful so far, but there's more. Having done that, we now go into the filters menu, we go to the blur menu and we select Gaussian blur, and what we want here is a figure of in the order of 250. Depending on the resolution of your image, you may want a little more or a little less, but this is a good starting point. We've applied a Gaussian blur of 250 pixels, and you can see that we've pretty much got just a very blurry area of lighter and darker tones. How does that work? Well, to make this work, we go to this layer and we select a different blending mode, and this time we use the overlay blend mode to remap the tonal areas in the image. Now, at full strength, it's too much. Turn that off, turn that on. It looks like someone turned the floodlights on inside the room. It's way too bright, but you can see that what it's done is it's lightened a lot of the shadow areas. So to really get the best out of this, we can just then adjust the opacity to what suits. Now, I think I did this previously and I dropped this all the way down to 30% because I just wanted a fairly subtle remapping of the tones. And what it's doing is it's darkening the brighter areas of the image and lightening the darker areas. And so it's just sort of putting back a little bit of life into the image. And if you find that there are parts of the image that you don't want this effect applied to, well, it's quite simple. Apply a mask to the image and then just paint in with your brush tool. And in this case, I don't want this area in the foreground. It's out of focus and it's uninteresting. So if I use the X key to change my color from white to black, or you can simply use that double-ended arrow to change. And I want this brush a bit larger and I want a fairly high opacity, and I'm just going to remove the effect of that inverse overlay from this foreground area because I don't particularly like the effect. And let's just have a look. And that, I think, is pretty much the image complete. And if we go back all the way down to look at the original image, that's what we started with. And if I just turn on the processing steps, I've already got that inverse overlay included in all of that. So let's just bring all those back in. So that's the original image. It was a little flat and dull, which is what you'd expect from a raw file, but it's got a good tonal range. And then with all of those adjustments, we've managed to bring this up into an image that has a lot of life in it, has lots of color and detail, and it's ready to print. So I hope that's been helpful. That's how I get the look that I like in my images, but your taste may differ, so feel free to adjust any of these steps to suit what you like. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.